At some point, you stop looking for answers out there. Not because you suddenly understand everything, but because something inside you has begun to speak on its own. For Pisces, change rarely arrives with loud noise. It doesn't crash in. It rises slowly, like water finding its level, quiet, but deep enough that you can't walk back to the old shore anymore. Things you once let slide start to feel uncomfortable. Silences you grew used to now carry questions you can no longer avoid. And then, a truth begins to reveal itself. Not to hurt you, but to show you how much you've grown. When that moment arrives, you understand something clearly. Some doors only open once, and from here, nothing can return to the way it was before. So, begin with that first feeling. Lately, Pisces may start to notice a very strange feeling entering their life. Not clear, not strong enough to name, but not small enough to ignore. It feels like standing in a familiar room. Everything is still there. The furniture hasn't moved. The light falls exactly where it always has. And yet, you know you are no longer the same person who once walked into that room. There hasn't been a major event forcing you to change. No dramatic announcement. Life continues along its usual rhythm. Work is still there. The people around you seem the same, but somewhere inside, something is shifting, very quietly, like underground water moving beneath the surface. No one sees it, but it slowly wears away the structures you once relied on. Pisces has always been sensitive to subtle changes. You tend to feel things before they become obvious truths. This time is no different. There is no proof, no clear explanation. Just a very real sense that things are no longer the same. What you once accepted easily now makes you pause. Words that once sounded familiar land differently. Relationships that once felt safe now carry a silence you can't quite name. You may have asked yourself if you're overthinking. You may have tried to brush it aside, telling yourself that everything will be fine. But Pisces' intuition is not easily fooled. It doesn't arrive to create fear. It arrives as a gentle reminder that you are growing in ways you haven't fully noticed yet. At this stage, you may feel yourself slowing down, not reacting as quickly, not rushing to explain yourself anymore. You begin listening more to the quiet inside. And within that quiet, you start to realize you no longer want to live on old momentum, not because it was wrong, but because it no longer fits the person you are becoming. This is not a time for big moves, not a moment for final decisions. It is simply a time when awareness deepens, an awareness that you have lived enough to no longer see the world through the same eyes, an awareness that your emotions are shifting, your values are adjusting, and what once felt acceptable now asks to be examined more honestly. Pisces may feel slightly out of place in a life that still looks familiar, but that doesn't mean you are lost. Sometimes feeling out of place is a sign that you've outgrown the old space, that your inner world needs a new shape to hold the understanding that has just begun to form. If you're in this phase, allow yourself to slow down. There's no need to name the feeling yet. No need to understand everything right away. Just listen. Stay with your emotions a little longer, because within this uncertainty, something important is taking shape. And even if you can't name it yet, you can feel it. You are standing at the edge of a new inner threshold. After a period of sensing those vague inner movements, Pisces may begin to notice that certain things in life are quietly rearranging themselves in their own way. Not because you were actively searching for answers, not because someone said anything out loud. Things simply start to reveal themselves, slowly, like morning light filling a room before you've fully opened your eyes. This time, the truth doesn't arrive as a shock. It comes through small details. A casual comment that leaves you silent longer than usual. A familiar situation, but your reaction feels different. A choice that once seemed insignificant. Yet, when you stand before it now, you realize you can't choose the same way anymore. And it's within these ordinary moments that the truth begins to surface. It may have something to do with a relationship you've invested a great deal of time in, not because the other person changed completely, but because you're no longer seeing that relationship through the same lens. You begin to notice things you once overlooked, not with blame, just with clearer awareness. And as your vision sharpens, you start to understand why that quiet sense of unease has been lingering inside you for so long. The truth may also touch decisions related to finances or personal values. Not necessarily big money. Sometimes it's simply about how you trade your time, your effort, your energy. You may start to ask yourself whether you've been giving too much without receiving enough respect in return. Not to demand more, just to understand where you truly stand within the choices you're making. And at times, the deepest truth isn't about others or external circumstances at all. It's about the way you've been treating yourself. You may realize how accustomed you've become to adjusting, enduring, softening everything just to keep the peace around you. You've been very good at understanding others. But perhaps now, it's time to ask whether you've truly been listening to yourself. What's important to note is that this truth isn't new. It's been there for a long time. You just weren't ready to face it before. Not because you were weak, but because every truth needs the right moment to be seen. And now, as Pisces' inner world has matured enough, what was once avoided can no longer remain in the shadows. You may feel a bit uncomfortable as the truth becomes clearer. Not because it's wrong, but because it asks you to look directly at the compromises you once made. At the same time, you may notice a very subtle sense of relief, because finally, you no longer have to pretend that everything is still fine the way it used to be. This phase doesn't ask you to act immediately. There's no need to cut things off, change everything, or make major decisions. It simply asks for a little more honesty with yourself, to allow the truth to exist in your awareness, without judgment, without pushing it away. Sometimes just facing the truth is already a significant step forward, and as Pisces begins to accept that some things cannot continue anymore, you also start to understand that you're approaching a new threshold, a threshold where you can no longer return to your old unconscious state, not because you want to be different, but because you've seen too clearly to ignore it any longer. If you find yourself in this moment, trust that the truth isn't here to take anything from you. It's here to place you back where you truly belong. And from this very point, the next changes will begin to form, naturally, without force, yet deep enough to guide you into a different chapter of your journey. As the truth becomes clearer, Pisces may come across a very quiet moment. No warning sound, no emotional surge. Just a brief second where you suddenly realize you're standing in a different place now. Not better, not worse, just different. And that difference no longer allows you to step back to where you once were. This moment often arrives in the most ordinary situations. It may happen while listening to a familiar story and noticing you no longer feel the same response. It may happen when you're asked to endure one more time, and this time, your body reacts before your mind does. Or it may come when you realize you no longer want to explain why you deserve respect. Not because you're angry, but because you understand too clearly now. At this point, Pisces begins to see an important truth. You are no longer the person you once were. Not because you chose to change, but because you've lived through enough to no longer remain untouched. What once earned your trust naturally now needs to be measured by how safe it feels inside. What once led you to sacrifice without question now asks to be weighed against self-respect. Even if you wanted to go back, you would realize you can't trust the same way anymore. Not because you've grown more suspicious, but because you've learned to listen to subtle signals. You can't endure the same way either, because your body and mind are tired of constantly reshaping themselves to fit old patterns. And you can't sacrifice the way you once did, because you now understand that sacrifice without appreciation slowly pulls you away from yourself. This point of no return doesn't arrive with force, it arrives with clarity. A very quiet clarity. You don't need to announce anything to anyone. You don't need to prove that you've changed. You simply stop responding the way you used to. And that shift in response says everything. Pisces may feel a slight sadness upon realizing you no longer fit into things that once felt so familiar. But this isn't the sadness of loss. It's the sadness of growth. The feeling of understanding that a part of you has completed its role, and it can't be carried into the next stretch of your journey. This phase may also bring a different kind of loneliness. Not because no one is around, but because not everyone can walk with you across this threshold. Some people will remain behind in the place where you once stood, and that isn't wrong. Everyone moves at their own pace. You've simply gone further or deeper in your own way. What matters most here isn't what you'll do next. It's what you've realized about yourself. You've realized you deserve relationships with greater clarity, choices that honor your inner values, a life where you don't have to shrink to fit someone else's expectations. When Pisces reaches this point of no return, it isn't an ending. It's the end of betraying yourself. And from that moment on, no matter how slowly you choose to walk, you won't lose your way again. After reaching the point of no return, Pisces may begin to notice that the greatest change doesn't show itself on the outside. There is no tense conversation, no clear goodbye, no dramatic moment that signals to others that you are no longer the same. Everything happens quietly. And yet, that quiet carries a weight you've never felt before. This time, the break doesn't come from action, but from awareness. You don't need to decide whether you're leaving or staying. You simply stop moving forward in the same way you used to. Old reflexes slowly fade. You no longer rush to explain yourself when you're misunderstood. You stop trying to clarify your emotions for those who aren't truly listening. You stop convincing yourself that everything is fine just to keep the surface calm. Pisces begins to notice something very subtle. For a long time, you've grown used to making yourself smaller, so things could flow smoothly. You chose silence to avoid conflict. You chose compromise to preserve connection. You chose endurance so no one else would be disappointed. And all of that once came from kindness, from your deep capacity for empathy. But at this stage, you may start to feel that this kind of sacrifice no longer brings the peace it once did. The inner shift begins to show itself in very small ways. You stop offering explanations for your choices, not because you've become colder, but because you understand that not everyone needs to understand you. You no longer feel the need to prove how much you've tried, because you are the one who knows how far you've gone to keep things from falling apart. This quiet break doesn't destroy relationships overnight, but it changes how you exist within them. You become quieter, not because you're withdrawing, but because you're standing more firmly in your own space. You begin allowing others to sense the change on their own, rather than trying to explain it with words. You may notice that some people aren't comfortable with this new version of you. They may feel distance. They may not understand why you no longer react the same way. But at this point, Pisces is mature enough to understand that not every distance needs to be closed. Some distances exist to help you see your boundaries more clearly. What's valuable in this phase is that you don't need to harden yourself to protect who you are. You don't need to cut things off dramatically. Your decisiveness comes from one place only. You stop hurting yourself to maintain false harmony. You choose honesty with your own feelings, even if that choice makes the space around you a little quieter. Pisces may feel a sense of emptiness when you no longer hold your familiar roles in certain relationships. But that emptiness is not loss. It is the space you need to breathe in your own rhythm. Within that space, you begin to hear your inner voice more clearly. Not a voice that rushes you, just a gentle certainty that you no longer need to live against yourself. This quiet break becomes the foundation for deeper changes ahead. It doesn't disturb your life loudly, but it reorganizes your inner order. And once the inside has shifted, the outside will eventually reflect it. No force required, no explanations needed. As long as you continue forward with respect for yourself, everything else will naturally find the place where it belongs. After those quiet breaks, Pisces may find themselves entering a very particular emotional state. Not intense, not collapsing, just a gentle sadness, softly present in the most ordinary moments. It may arrive when you're sitting alone at the end of the day, when there's no one left to please, no role left to carry. A sadness that doesn't frighten you, but is enough to let you notice that something inside feels a little more open than before. This sadness is not like the ones Pisces has known in the past. It doesn't pull you down into emotional depths. It doesn't make you question your worth. It's simply a quiet sense of tenderness for things that once felt familiar, but no longer fit. Like looking back at an old road you once walked closely with, knowing you traveled it fully, and also knowing you won't be returning there again. At this point, Pisces may realize that nothing has truly been lost. Not a relationship, not an opportunity, not an essential part of who you are. What has fallen away is what never truly belonged to you in the first place. Expectations you carried for others, emotional responsibilities you took on without anyone clearly offering them to you, versions of yourself shaped only to match the situation. This sadness appears as a natural process of cleansing. It doesn't ask you to understand everything right away. It doesn't demand that you move past it quickly. It only asks that you allow yourself to feel. Because emotions, when met with honesty, always know how to regulate themselves. You don't need to push this sadness away. You don't need to hold on to it either. Just let it pass through, like water washing away what has been building up for far too long. In this quiet space, Pisces may begin to sense more clearly the difference between loneliness and being alone. You don't feel abandoned. You simply feel closer to yourself. There is no longer the noise of needing to please someone, no longer the pressure to maintain a familiar image. There is just you, with real emotions, real thoughts, and your own breathing. This cleansing sadness also carries a very gentle grace. It allows you to look back at what you've lived through with less judgment. You don't blame yourself for having given too much. You don't blame others for being unable to return what you hoped for. You simply understand that at that time, everyone did the best they could with the awareness they had. And that understanding is enough to let go. Pisces carries deep emotion by nature, but also holds a profound capacity to heal. When you allow this sadness to exist, you're giving yourself a chance to rebalance, not by becoming stronger, but by becoming more real. You don't need to prove that you're okay. You only need to know that you're moving in the right direction. This phase may not bring joy right away, but it brings a very real sense of relief. Relief from carrying emotional weight that was never yours to hold. Relief from roles that no longer fit. Relief from believing that peace comes from holding on to everything. Instead, you begin to trust that peace comes from knowing what can be gently set down. This gentle sadness doesn't stay forever. It remains only long enough to complete its purpose, to remind you that you have grown, that you've learned to care for yourself in a more sustainable way. And when it settles, what remains is not emptiness, but a cleaner inner space. A space where you can begin to welcome what's next with greater clarity and deeper appreciation. When the sadness has settled, when what no longer belongs to you has been gently placed back where it belongs, Pisces may begin to sense a very different state. Not excitement, not celebration, but a deep inner steadiness, like the surface of water after a strong wave has passed, no longer restless, no longer cloudy, just calm and clear. The old chapter doesn't close with an exclamation point. It closes with a very quiet nod inside you. There's no need to look back too much, no need to prove what you've been through. You simply know that you're standing at a different point on your own path. And from here, you won't be moving forward the old way anymore. Pisces begins to feel clearer with themselves in a very natural way. No need for strict rules, no promises to become someone else. You simply recognize what makes you feel safe and what slowly pulls you away from yourself. This clarity doesn't come from analysis. It comes from an inner feeling that has finally been listened to long enough. At the same time, you become calmer with others, not because you've closed your heart, but because you're no longer reacting from old wounds. Words, attitudes, expectations from others no longer pull you out of balance so easily. You know what belongs to you to carry and what doesn't. Calm is not indifference. Calm is when you no longer need tension to protect yourself. Pisces also becomes more selective about what you allow into your life. Not because you're afraid of being hurt, but because you understand the value of presence. You understand that every relationship, every opportunity, every promise carries energy, and you no longer want to give that energy away unconsciously. You choose instead from a place of self-respect. This new chapter doesn't promise that everything will be easier, but it offers something very real, the feeling that you're living more truthfully. You don't need to become someone entirely different. You're simply living closer to who you truly are. A version of yourself that doesn't need to try so hard to be accepted. From here, nothing can return to the way it was before. Not because you closed a door behind you, but because you crossed a level of awareness that can't be undone. You've seen what you needed to see. You've understood what you needed to understand. And once you understand, you can't pretend you never did. If there's anything worth keeping after all these shifts, it's a gentle trust in yourself. Not blind faith, just the trust that you can listen inwardly, that you can adjust when needed, that you can move forward without having to hurt yourself ever again. Pisces carries a deeply sensitive heart, and that depth, when placed in the right space, becomes a quiet, enduring strength. This new chapter doesn't ask you to rush. It simply invites you to be more present in each moment, to move a little slower, to be a little more honest, and a little more gentle with yourself. This is not loss. This is growth you were ready to receive, and as you move forward from here, you don't carry regret. You carry the lightness of someone who has set down what is no longer needed, leaving both hands free to receive a new journey, in a way that belongs only to Pisces.